The concrete mixer's engine roared as it backed into David's yard, drowning out Karen's hysterical screams from across the fence. "You can't do this. My children have rights." But as the first load of cement poured into the sparkling pool where her kids had trespassed for months, Karen's face went white. She didn't know about the cameras. She didn't know about the lawsuit. And she definitely didn't know that in exactly 3 hours, when those police sirens wailed down Maple Street, it wouldn't be David getting arrested the splash echoed across David Chen's backyard at 6:47 a.m., followed by the unmistakable sound of children's laughter. He pressed his face against the kitchen window, his coffee mug trembling in his grip as he watched 2 blonde heads bobbing in his pool. Again. "Emma. Tyler. Get out of there this instant." The shrill voice belonged to Karen Morrison, his next-door neighbor, who was marching across a pristine lawn in a terrycloth robe, her face flushed with what David had learned to recognize as her signature blend of entitlement and indignation. David set down his mug and stepped onto his back deck. The morning air was crisp, but his blood was boiling. "Karen, this is the 4th time this week." She whirled around, her blonde hair whipping across her shoulders. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, David. They're just kids having fun. When I was their age, when you were their age, you probably asked permission before using someone else's property." David's voice was steady, but his hands were clenched at his sides. 3 months. 3 months of this madness since Karen. And her family had moved in next door. Permission. Karen's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "It's a pool, not the crown jewels. Besides, you're never even home to use it." That stung because it was partially true. David worked long hours as a software engineer, often not returning home until after dark. But that didn't give Karen's 8 and 10-year-old children free rein to treat his backyard like their personal water park. "Mom, the water's getting cold." Emma called out, her small hands gripping the pool's edge. "Just a few more minutes, sweetie." Karen called back, then fixed David with a defiant stare. "Look, I get that you're uptight about your property, but they're not hurting anything. Kids need to be kids." David had heard this speech before. Usually, he'd retreat inside, wait for them to leave, then spend his evening fishing leaves and grass out of his pool filter. But something about the way Karen stood there, arms crossed, chin jutted out like she was defending her right to his property, made something snap inside him. "Get them out. Now." Karen's eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me. You heard me. Get your kids out of my pool, off my property, and keep them there." The children had stopped playing, sensing the tension in their mother's voice and the stranger's sharp tone. Tyler, the older boy, started swimming toward the shallow end. "You know what?" Karen's voice rose to a pitch that made the neighborhood. "Dogs start barking. You're being completely unreasonable. This is exactly what's wrong with society today. People like you who can't share, who think a fence makes them king of their little kingdom." "This isn't about sharing, Karen. This is about trespassing. This is about liability. What happens if one of your kids gets hurt in my pool? What happens if they drown?" Karen's face went pale for just a moment before the color rushed back, deeper than before. "Are you threatening my children?" "I'm explaining reality to you." David pulled out his phone. "I've been documenting every instance of this. Photos, videos, timestamps. Do you have any idea what my insurance company would say if they knew unsupervised? Children were regularly using my pool without permission. You've been taking pictures of my children." Karen's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I've been documenting trespassing on my property." Emma had climbed out of the pool and was wrapping herself in a towel, shivering. Tyler followed, both children looking confused and a little scared. "Mom." Emma's voice was small. "It's okay, baby. The mean man wants us to leave his precious pool." Karen's eyes never left David's face as she spoke, her words dripping with venom. David felt something cold settle in his chest. Mean man. That's what his neighbor thought of him. The guy who worked 60-hour weeks to afford this house, who'd spent his weekends last summer installing that pool himself, who'd never once complained about their dog barking at all hours or their music playing too loud during their frequent backyard parties. "Karen," he said quietly, "I want you to listen very carefully. If I find your children in my pool again, ever, I'm calling the police. I'm also calling my lawyer." She laughed, but it sounded forced. Over a pool. You'd really call the police. On children. I'd call the police on anyone who repeatedly trespassed on my property after being asked to stop. We'll see about that. Karen grabbed her children's hands, pulling them toward the gap in the fence, a gap that David suddenly realized they must have created. Come on, kids. Some people have forgotten what it means to be neighborly. As they disappeared through the fence, David heard Tyler ask, "Mom, why was that man so angry?" "Because he's a selfish, bitter person who doesn't understand that property comes with community responsibility," Karen replied, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. David stood alone on his deck, staring at the pool that now felt contaminated by the morning's confrontation. Community responsibility. The phrase echoed in his head as he noticed the muddy footprints on his pool deck, the candy wrapper floating in the shallow end, the small crack in one of his decorative planters where someone had obviously stepped on it. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos he'd been taking. Dozens of them. Kids in his pool, Karen sunbathing on his pool furniture, Tyler using his outdoor shower. He'd been patient. He'd been reasonable. He'd tried the neighborly approach. But as he looked at the gap in his fence on his property, that had been widened to accommodate easier access, David realized something had fundamentally shifted inside him. He dialed a number he'd been avoiding for weeks. Peterson. Construction. "Yeah, this is David Chen on Maple Street. I need a quote for pool removal." "Yes, complete removal. Tomorrow." "That would be perfect." As he hung up, David caught sight of Karen watching him from her kitchen window. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. Instead, she raised her coffee mug in a mocking toast. David smiled back and raised his phone, snapping one final photo. By sunset tomorrow, Karen Morrison was going to learn that some property owners bite back, and her reaction would be so much worse than he could have possibly imagined. The rumble of heavy machinery at 7 a.m. sharp sent vibrations through every house on Maple Street. David stood at his living room window, coffee in hand, watching as a massive excavator rolled off the trailer and into his driveway. Behind it came the concrete mixer, its rotating drum gleaming in the morning sun like a weapon of suburban warfare. Holy shit. The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, David's neighbor from across the street, who'd stepped out to grab his newspaper and instead found himself witnessing what looked like a construction site setup. David's doorbell rang before the excavator had even finished positioning itself. He didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. Karen stood on his porch in yesterday's clothes, her hair uncombed, her eyes wild with the kind of desperate fury that comes from a sleepless night spent plotting revenge. Behind her, pressed against the living room window of her house, were Emma and Tyler's small faces, watching their playground disappear. "You cannot be serious," she said the moment David opened the door. "Good morning, Karen. Lovely day for construction, isn't it?" Her voice cracked like a whip. "This is insane. You're actually going to destroy a perfectly good pool just to spite my children. I'm making a property improvement. What I do with my land is my business." The excavator's engine roared to life, drowning out Karen's response. David could see her mouth moving, her face growing redder by the second, but the beautiful thing about heavy machinery was that it made conversation impossible. The operator, a weathered man named Jim who'd given David the quote, climbed down from his cab and approached them. "Mr. Chen, we are ready to start draining. Should take about 2 hours, then we can begin the excavation." Karen's eyes went wide. "Draining? You mean there's still time to—" "No," David cut her off firmly. "There's no time to anything. This is happening." Jim nodded and returned to his machine. Within minutes, the pool circulation system was humming as thousands of gallons of crystal clear water began flowing out through a hose that snaked across David's yard and into the storm drain. Karen watched in horror as the water level dropped inch by inch. "David, please, can we just talk about this like adults?" "We tried talking. You made it clear that my property boundaries mean nothing to you." "I never said that." David pulled out his phone and scrolled to a text message from 3 weeks ago. Quote, "Property lines are just arbitrary government constructs designed to keep people from building community." Your words, Karen, from your neighborhood Facebook group post about shared resources. Her face flushed. That was a philosophical discussion about urban planning. And this is a practical application of property rights. By 9 a.m., a crowd had gathered. Marcus Webb had been joined by elderly Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down, the Johnsons with their twin toddlers, and several other neighbors who'd never seen a pool removal in person. Some were filming with their phones. Karen had retreated to her yard but kept pacing along the fence line, her voice carrying over the machinery noise as she conducted what appeared to be a running commentary for anyone who would listen. "This is what happens when you try to be neighborly," she shouted toward the growing audience. "I try to teach my children about community, about sharing, and this is how I'm repaid." Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived on the street for 37 years, shook her head. "Sharing is one thing, dear. But those children have been treating that pool like their personal playground for months. They are children. They need exercise. They need supervision and permission," Marcus called out. "My kids ask before they use my neighbor's basketball hoop." Karen whirled on him. "Your neighbor's basketball hoop isn't blocking access to healthy recreation." "Neither is David's pool," Mrs. Patterson replied dryly. "It's on his property." By 10:30, the pool was empty, revealing years of accumulated debris, a few forgotten pool toys, and, much to David's surprise, several items that clearly didn't belong to him. A pink water bottle with Emma written in purple marker. A pair of swim goggles. A small inflatable unicorn. Karen saw them too. Her face went white. "Jim," David called out, "can you bag up anything that's not pool equipment? I want to return these items to their owners." The pointed gesture wasn't lost on anyone. Karen had been caught red-handed with evidence of just how extensively her children had been using David's pool. "This is harassment," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. The excavator's bucket bit into the pool's concrete shell with a grinding screech that made everyone wince. Chunks of concrete and rebar flew into the waiting dumpster. Emma and Tyler had pressed their faces so hard against their window that David could see their breath fogging the glass. Karen's phone rang. She answered it with shaking hands. "Karen Morrison." "Yes, I'm the one who posted in the neighborhood group." "No, he's actually doing it. Right now." "Yes, I think this constitutes property damage somehow." "What do you mean it's his property?" David couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but Karen's expression grew increasingly desperate as she spoke. "But there has to be some kind of ordinance. Something about destroying valuable amenities. Community standards." She hung up and immediately dialed another number. "City Planning Office? Yes, I need to file a complaint about a neighbor who's destroying property that affects community welfare." "What do you mean that's not how it works?" Call after call, Karen worked her way through what appeared to be every municipal office she could think of. Code enforcement, the mayor's office, even the fire department on the theory that pool removal might be a safety hazard. Each conversation ended the same way, with Karen looking more frustrated and David feeling more vindicated. By noon, half the pool was gone. The excavator had broken through the deep end and was systematically reducing David's backyard oasis to rubble and memories. The crowd of neighbors had thinned, but a few diehards remained, including Marcus, who'd brought lawn chairs and was treating the whole thing like entertainment. That's when Karen played her final card. "David," she called out, her voice different now, softer, more vulnerable. "Can we please just talk? Away from all this noise." Against his better judgment, David signaled Jim to take a break. The sudden silence felt heavy with possibility and dread. Karen approached the fence, her children flanking her like tiny bodyguards. Emma's eyes were red from crying. "Look," Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know I've been difficult. Maybe I didn't handle the pool situation the right way. But those kids have been looking forward to swimming all week. Tyler's birthday party is this Saturday, and all his friends were planning to swim." She paused, letting the weight of disappointed children settle between them. "What if I paid you for pool usage? Like a membership fee, $50 a month, and I'll supervise them personally every time." David felt something twist in his chest. The reasonable part of him, the part that remembered being a kid who just wanted to swim, wavered for a moment. Then he looked at his half-destroyed pool, at the thousands of dollars this was costing him, at the months of disrespect and entitlement that had led to this moment. "Karen," he said quietly, 3 months ago, If you'd knocked on my door and asked if your kids could occasionally use the pool under supervision, I probably would have said yes. Hope flickered in her eyes. But you didn't ask. You took. You taught your children that other people's property is theirs to use whenever they want. You made me the villain for trying to protect my own investment. The hope died. So no. No membership fee. No supervised visits. No pool. Karen's composure finally cracked completely. You bastard. You absolute bastard. Those are innocent children. Those are children whose mother taught them that trespassing is acceptable. I'm calling the police. Please do. I'm sure they'll be very interested in your children's collection of toys from my property. Karen's face went through a series of expressions: rage, calculation, desperation, and finally, something that looked almost like madness. Fine, she said, her voice eerily calm. If that's how you want to play this. She turned and walked back to her house, her children trailing behind her like ducklings. But just before she reached her door, she stopped and looked back at David with a smile that made his blood run cold. You have no idea what you've just started, she called out, loud enough for the remaining neighbors to hear. Then she disappeared. Inside, and David was left standing next to his half-destroyed pool, wondering what fresh hell Karen Morrison was about to unleash on his life. David's first clue that Karen had escalated beyond reason came at 6:15 a.m. the next morning, when he opened his front door to find a citation from the city taped to the glass. Violation of Municipal Ordinance 847B. Construction work conducted. Outside permitted hours. He stared at the yellow paper, his coffee growing cold in his hand. Construction before 7 a.m. was indeed prohibited, but yesterday's work had started precisely at 7. He checked his phone for the timestamp on the photos he'd taken. 6:59 a.m. when the equipment arrived, 7:02 a.m. when the first engine started. Someone had lied to the city inspector. His phone buzzed with a text from Jim, the excavator operator. Hey man, got a weird call from city enforcement asking about yesterday's start time. Told them 7 a.m. sharp like we discussed. Thought you should know. David's jaw tightened as he looked across the street. Karen's living room curtains twitched closed. The morning's mail brought more surprises. A certified letter from something called Morrison Legal Advocacy, which turned out to be Karen's husband Brad, who'd apparently decided to dust off his law degree from 20 years ago. The letter was a masterpiece of legal-sounding gibberish demanding cessation of all property modifications that negatively impact neighborhood children's recreational opportunities and threatening litigation for creating an attractive nuisance and then maliciously removing it. David photographed both documents and forwarded them to his actual lawyer, Rebecca Martinez, with a text, "My neighbor is losing her mind. How worried should I be?" Her response came back within minutes. Citation is bogus. Contest it. Legal. Threat is nonsense. Ignore it. But document everything. This feels like harassment escalation. By noon, David understood what Rebecca meant by escalation. His Amazon delivery driver, a guy named Jose who'd been bringing packages to Maple Street for 3 years, knocked on his door with a confused expression. "Mr. Chen, I've got your packages, but I need to ask, did you change your address? Because I've got 3 different neighbors telling me you moved and packages should go to 247 instead of 249. David's address was 249. Karen lived at 247. No, Jose. I definitely didn't move. Same address as always. Jose shrugged and handed over the packages, but David could see him making a note on his delivery device. Just thought it was weird. Usually when people move, they tell me directly. The UPS driver that afternoon told a similar story. So did the mail carrier, who mentioned that someone had called the post office claiming David was temporarily redirecting mail due to construction disruption. David walked to his mailbox and found it had been tampered with. The lock mechanism was loose, and there were scratches around the keyhole as if someone had tried to force it open. His doorbell rang at 4 p.m. Through the peephole, he saw a woman in a crisp business suit holding a clipboard. "Mr. Chen, I'm Sandra Willis from Child Protective Services. We received a report about unsafe conditions affecting neighborhood children." David's blood went cold. "I'm sorry, what?" "May I come in? Someone reported that you've created a hazardous construction site that's attracting children, and that you've been, quote, aggressively confronting minors who wander onto your property." David let her in, his mind racing. Through his living room window, he could see Karen's house, and sure enough, she was stationed at her kitchen window with a perfect view of his front door. Sandra was professional but thorough. She inspected his backyard, now a perfectly ordinary construction site with appropriate safety barriers and signage. She reviewed his security camera footage, which clearly showed the timeline of events and, more importantly, showed that he'd never once aggressively confronted any children, only asked them to leave. "Mr. Chen," she said after 40 minutes of investigation, "I want you to know that this report appears to be completely unfounded. Your property is properly secured, and your interactions with the children were entirely appropriate. However," she paused, consulting her notes. "I do have to ask, do you have any idea why someone would make these allegations?" David gestured toward Karen's house. "My neighbor has been upset about me removing my pool. Her children had been using it without permission for months." Sandra's expression didn't change, but David caught something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition that suggested this wasn't her first encounter with a vindictive neighbor wielding CPS as a weapon. "I see. Well, Mr. Chen, I'll be filing a report that finds no evidence of unsafe conditions or inappropriate behavior. But I do want to warn you, false reports waste valuable resources that could be used helping children who actually need protection." After she left, David sat in his kitchen staring at his phone. Part of him wanted to march over to Karen's house and confront her directly. But Rebecca's words echoed in his head, "Document everything." Instead, he opened a new folder on his computer and labeled it Morrison Harassment Campaign. The bogus city citation went in first, followed by photos of his tampered mailbox, screenshots of the delivery confusion, and a detailed summary of the CPS visit. His phone rang at 7 p.m. Unknown number. "David Chen." "Yes. This is Officer Martinez with the County Sheriff's Department. We've received a report about someone making threats against children in your neighborhood. Are you available to speak with us?" David's vision blurred with rage. "Yes, officer. I'm very available to speak with you." 20 minutes later, Deputy Martinez, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s, sat in David's living room reviewing the same security footage Sandra had seen earlier. "Mr. Chen, I have to tell you, this is one of the more clear-cut cases I've seen. The person who made this report claimed you threatened to harm neighborhood children if they came near your property. But your own video evidence shows you simply asking trespassing children to leave, which is entirely within your rights." She closed her notebook and fixed him with a steady gaze. "Someone is making false reports about you. Multiple false reports. That's a pattern we take seriously." David felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Officer, I have to ask, is making false police reports illegal?" "Yes, Mr. Chen. It's a misdemeanor in this county. Filing a false report wastes police resources and can constitute harassment of the person being reported." After she left, David stood at his front window and saw Karen watching from her kitchen. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. Instead, she held up her phone and appeared to take a photo of him. David smiled and waved. Then he pulled out his own phone and called Rebecca Martinez. "Rebecca, it's David Chen. I need to discuss filing harassment charges against my neighbor." "No, I'm not overreacting. She's filed false reports with the city, tried to redirect my mail, called CPS with fabricated allegations, and just had the police investigate me for threatening children. Yes, I have documentation for all of it." As he spoke, David watched Karen's kitchen window. She was still there, still watching, still holding her phone like a weapon. But for the first time since this war began, David wasn't the one who needed to worry about what the authorities would find. Karen Morrison had just made the kind of mistake that smart lawyers dream about, a documented pattern of false accusations that could be traced directly back to her. And she had no idea that her next call to the police would be the one that finally brought them to her door instead of his. The concrete truck arrived at exactly 8 a.m. on Friday morning, its massive rotating drum filled with enough cement to permanently erase any trace that a pool had ever existed in David's backyard. He'd specifically scheduled the final phase of the project for the weekend, knowing that Karen's children would be home to witness the absolute finality of their lost playground. David stood on his deck with his morning coffee, watching Jim position the truck's chute over the excavated hole. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. He was literally cementing his victory over Karen's sense of entitlement. "You ready for this, Mr. Chen?" Jim called out. "Once this goes in, there's no going back. I've never been more ready for anything in my life." The concrete poured like grey lava, filling the rectangular void where crystal-clear water had once sparkled. The sound was oddly satisfying, a low, wet rumble that spoke of permanence and finality. Karen's reaction was immediate and spectacular. Her back door slammed open so hard it bounced off the exterior wall. She stormed across a yard in pajamas and bare feet, her hair wild, her face a mask of absolute fury. "Stop! Stop right now!" She reached the fence line and began climbing it, actually climbing it, like some deranged suburban ninja. David watched, in fascination, as his 40-something neighbor hauled herself over the 6-foot wooden barrier and dropped into his yard. "Karen, you're trespassing," David said calmly. "I don't care." She ran toward the concrete truck, waving her arms like she was trying to stop a runaway train. "You can't do this. This is destruction of community property." Jim, who'd been in construction for 30 years and had seen his share of neighborhood drama, calmly continued pouring concrete while keeping one eye on the hysterical woman approaching his equipment. You need to stay back from the machinery," he called out. "This is a construction zone." Karen ignored him completely. She grabbed a shovel from David's toolshed and began frantically trying to dig the wet concrete out of the hole, flinging grey sludge in all directions. "I'll stop this. I'll save it. You can't destroy something this valuable." David pulled out his phone and started recording. This was beyond anything he could have imagined, even in his wildest predictions of Karen's breakdown. "Karen, you're destroying my property and interfering with permitted construction. I'm asking you to leave immediately." She whirled on him, the shovel raised like a weapon, concrete dripping from the blade. "Your property. Your property. This affects the whole neighborhood. Those children's mental health depends on having access to recreation." Mental health. David couldn't keep the incredulity out of his voice. "Karen, it's a pool. There are public pools. There are community centers. There are. Don't you lecture me about my children's needs." The shovel came down hard, not at David but at his patio table, splintering the glass top into a spider web of cracks. Then she swung again, this time at his outdoor umbrella, tearing the fabric and sending the whole thing toppling over. Jim had shut off the concrete flow and was climbing down from his truck. "I'm calling the police if you don't stop right now." "Good. Call them. They need to see what this monster is doing to our neighborhood." David's phone was still recording as Karen continued her rampage, destroying his patio furniture, his garden planters, even his outdoor grill, all while screaming about community rights and children's welfare. Emma and Tyler had appeared at their bedroom window, their small faces pressed against the glass, watching their mother's complete meltdown with expressions of confusion and growing fear. Other neighbors began emerging from their houses. Marcus. Webb came jogging over from across the street, still in his running clothes. Mrs. Patterson appeared at her front door, her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. "Karen." Marcus called out. "What the hell are you doing?" She turned on him with wild eyes. "I'm protecting our children's rights. David thinks he owns the whole neighborhood, but community resources belong to everyone. It's his pool, Karen. On his property. Property is theft." Karen screamed, a line that would have sounded ridiculous if it hadn't been delivered while she was standing in someone else's backyard holding a shovel covered in concrete. That's when she made the mistake that would change everything. Karen pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. "Yes, this is an emergency. There's a man destroying community property and threatening children. He's got construction equipment and is being violent and aggressive. 249 Maple Street. Send someone immediately." David looked at Jim, who was still recording on his own phone. They both looked at Marcus, who was recording on his phone. Mrs. Patterson was recording from her doorway. Even some of the other neighbors who'd gathered were holding up their phones. Karen Morrison had just made a false 911 call claiming David was being violent and aggressive, while she stood in his backyard after trespassing, vandalizing his property, and wielding a shovel, all captured on multiple cameras from multiple angles. "Karen," David said quietly, "you should probably call your husband." Something in his tone must have penetrated her rage-fueled haze because she stopped mid-swing at his outdoor speaker system and looked around. For the first time, she seemed to notice the crowd that had gathered. The phones pointing at her. The concrete on her pajamas. The shovel in her hands. The destruction she'd caused. I was just... She stammered. The sirens were already audible in the distance, growing louder by the second. "Karen," Marcus said gently, "you need to put down the shovel and go home. Right now." But it was too late for that. Karen Morrison had spent 3 days filing false reports, harassing city officials, and lying to police officers. She'd climbed a fence to trespass on private property, destroyed thousands of dollars worth of patio furniture, interfered with permitted construction, and topped it all off with a false emergency call that had pulled police resources away from real emergencies. And every second of her final breakdown had been recorded from multiple angles by multiple witnesses. The sirens were getting closer. David looked at his neighbor, really looked at her, and for a moment felt something almost like pity. Karen Morrison had convinced herself that she was fighting for something noble, something righteous. In her mind, she was the hero of this story, protecting children and community values against a selfish property owner. But heroes don't climb fences to destroy other people's belongings while making false emergency calls. The first police car turned onto Maple Street, followed by a second, then a third. Karen's face went white as she realized that this time, the cavalry wasn't coming to rescue her. This time, they were coming for her. She dropped the shovel and ran for the fence, but her bare feet slipped on the concrete slick grass. She went down hard, her phone flying out of her hand and shattering on David's patio stones. And that's how the police found her, lying in a pile of concrete and patio furniture debris, covered in grey sludge, in someone else's backyard, while a crowd of neighbors watched and recorded the spectacular end of Karen Morrison's war against property rights. The irony was perfect, and David couldn't help but smile as the first officer approached his back gate. After 3 days of Karen calling the police on him, they were finally going to have that conversation she'd been wanting. Just not the way she'd planned. Officer Sarah Martinez, the same deputy who'd investigated Karen's false report about David threatening children, stepped through the back gate and surveyed the scene with the weary expression of someone who'd seen this exact type of neighborhood meltdown too many times before. Karen was still on the ground, covered in concrete, her pajamas torn from her fence-climbing adventure. She looked up at the officer with desperate, pleading eyes. "Officer Martinez, thank God you're here. This man has been terrorizing the neighborhood. He's destroying community property and, Officer Martinez's voice cut through Karen's rambling like a blade. "I need you to stop talking and listen very carefully. You are currently trespassing on private property. There is evidence of property damage all around you. And you just made a false 911 call claiming someone was being violent when our dispatch recording clearly shows you were the one doing the screaming." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But he threatened my children. He's been harassing us for days." Officer Martinez looked at David, who held up his phone. "I've got everything recorded, officer, including her climbing my fence, destroying my property, and making the false emergency call." "I'd like to see that footage, Mr. Chen." As David showed the video, more police cars arrived. Karen seemed to shrink with each new siren, the reality of her situation finally penetrating her fury-clouded mind. "Mrs. Morrison," Officer Martinez said after reviewing the footage, "I'm placing you under arrest for criminal trespass, destruction of property, and filing a false police report." "What?" Karen's voice cracked. "You can't arrest me. I'm the victim here." But the officer was already reading her rights while a second officer helped Karen to her feet. The concrete had dried on her pajamas, making her look like some bizarre statue come to life. "Mom." Emma's voice carried across the yard. Both children were pressed against their bedroom window, crying as they watched their mother being handcuffed in a neighbor's backyard. David felt that stab of sympathy again, but it was quickly overwhelmed by anger at Karen's complete lack of consideration for how her actions would affect her own children. "Officer Martinez," David said quietly, "there's more." He pulled out his phone and showed her the documentation he'd been collecting. The falsified city citation, the tampered mailbox, the redirected deliveries, the bogus CPS report, the previous false police report. Officer Martinez reviewed each piece of evidence with growing incredulity. "Mr. Chen, This is a pattern of harassment that goes far beyond today's incident. We are talking about multiple felony charges here. Karen overheard and began struggling against the handcuffs. Harassment. Harassment. He destroyed a pool that my children used for exercise and mental health. He's the one who, Mrs. Morrison, the second officer said firmly, you used someone else's pool without permission for months, then filed false reports with multiple city agencies when he removed it from his own property. That's not a civil dispute. That's criminal harassment. Brad Morrison's BMW came screeching around the corner just as they were loading Karen into the police car. He leaped out, still in his work clothes, his face a mask of panic and confusion. What's happening? Karen texted me about some emergency and then stopped responding. Officer Martinez approached him with professional courtesy. Mr. Morrison, your wife has been arrested for criminal trespass, destruction of property, filing, false police reports, and harassment. She's going to need a lawyer. Brad's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, a kind of defeated recognition that suggested this wasn't entirely unexpected. How bad is it? He asked quietly. David stepped forward. Brad, I'm sorry your kids have to see this, but your wife has been filing false reports about me for 3 days. She climbed my fence, destroyed my property, and made a false 911 call while I was having concrete poured. It's all on video. Brad looked at the destruction in David's yard, then at his own children crying in the window, then at his concrete-covered wife sitting in the back of a police car. Jesus Christ, Karen, he muttered. Then, louder, how much is this going to cost to fix? David appreciated that Brad's first concern was making things right. The patio furniture and grill are probably $3,000 in damages. But honestly, Brad, I'm more worried about the harassment charges. She's been filing false reports with everyone from the city inspector to Child Protective Services. Brad's face went pale. CPS? She called CPS on you. Claimed I was endangering children and acting aggressively toward minors. All eyes, all. Documented. Mr. Morrison, Officer Martinez interjected, your wife is looking at multiple felony charges. The false police reports alone carry up to a year in jail each, and she's made at least 3 that we can prove. Add in the harassment pattern, and she could be facing serious prison time. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Brad looked at his house, where Emma and Tyler were still pressed against the window, then at the police car containing his wife. What can I do to make this right? He asked David. Before David could answer, Karen's voice erupted from the police car. Even through the closed windows, her screaming was audible. Community property. Children's rights. Property is theft. Officer Martinez shook her head. Mr. Morrison, your wife needs psychiatric evaluation along with legal representation. This level of delusion about property rights isn't normal. As the police cars pulled away, sirens wailing, the crowd of neighbors slowly dispersed. Marcus Webb lingered, shaking his head in amazement. Dude, he said to David, I've lived in suburbia for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like that. Mrs. Patterson approached from across the street, moving slowly but purposefully. David, honey, I want you to know that everyone on this street has been talking about Karen's behavior. We all saw what she was doing to you. If you need character, witnesses for court, you've got the whole neighborhood. Brad Morrison returned an hour later with his checkbook and a contractor he'd apparently called from the police station parking lot. David, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, I know money doesn't fix everything, but I want to make this right. The contractor says he can replace everything Karen destroyed for about $4,000. I'm writing you a check for $5,000 to cover any inconvenience. David looked at the check, then at Brad's defeated posture. What about Karen? She's being held pending arraignment. Her lawyer says the DA is treating this as a serious harassment case because of the false reports to multiple agencies. She could be looking at 2 to 3 years if convicted on all charges. And the kids? Brad's voice cracked slightly. They're asking why Mommy was screaming and why the police took her away. How do I explain that their mother lost her mind over a neighbor's pool? David felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. Karen had brought this entirely on herself, but her children didn't deserve to watch their mother's public breakdown and arrest. Brad, he said carefully, I want you to know that I never wanted it to escalate this far. If Karen had just asked to use the pool in the first place, or if she'd accepted my boundaries when I asked her to stop, none of this would have happened. I know, Brad replied. Karen has issues with authority, with being told no. I've been dealing with it for years, but I never thought she'd go this far. 3 weeks later, David's backyard was restored. New patio furniture, a new grill, new planters full of fresh flowers. The concrete pad where his pool used to be had been covered with decorative stones and turned into a meditation garden. Karen Morrison pled guilty to multiple harassment charges and was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 2 years of probation and mandatory anger management counseling. The judge, in handing down the sentence, noted that the systematic campaign of false reports represented a serious abuse of public resources and a dangerous precedent for neighborhood disputes. Brad and the children moved out 2 months later. Before they left, Brad knocked on David's door one final time. "The kids wanted me to give you this," he said, handing over a hand-drawn card. Emma had written sorry in purple crayon, with a picture of a house and some flowers. Tyler had added a stick figure that was apparently meant to be David, with a speech bubble saying thank you for being nice to us. "They don't really understand what their mother did," Brad explained. "But they know she hurt you, and they wanted to apologize." David looked at the card, feeling that familiar tightness in his chest. "Brad, for what it's worth, I never had any problem with Emma and Tyler. They are good kids." They are. And maybe now they'll learn that other people's property deserves respect. As Brad's car pulled away for the last time, David stood in his transformed backyard, surrounded by the peace and quiet he'd been seeking all along. The meditation garden was beautiful, and he'd already gotten more use out of it than he'd ever gotten out of the pool. His phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer, Rebecca Martinez, saw the news article about the sentencing. How does it feel to have the most dramatic property dispute in county history? David looked at his peaceful garden, then at the fence that no longer had gaps cut in it, then at the house next door where a for sale sign swayed gently in the breeze. He texted back, "Like justice." And for the first time in months, David Chen sat in his backyard without worry.